and thank you everyone for attending this presentation. So my talk is on biosolids management. It's a big picture talk, and I'll cover some of the research results, but I will also try to cover latest developments on emerging pollutants and pathogens. Okay, so as Valerie mentioned, I'm very closely involved in International Water Association, and I was the past chair of the specialist group on sludge management. I'm still very involved in this group. So this is a wonderful group for those of you who are considering to be members to International Water Association. You know, there's lots of new things to learn from other countries, how they manage their sludge, best practices. So I will try to bring some of that experience and knowledge to this presentation as well. Okay, so I'm not gonna get into details, but I understand this is a diverse group. Just very briefly, sludge is the solids collected after wastewater treatment. And so this can be primary treatment, physical treatment, biological treatment, chemical treatment. And they're typically combined and then go through another treatment train specifically designed for sludge. And the issue with sludge is typically whatever is like you don't want in wastewater, heavy metals, you know, these emerging contaminants, pathogens, they end up concentrating in sludge. So sludge treatment is a challenge, and it's a major portion of the operational budget of wastewater treatment plants. So if you look at the global picture very quickly, sludge quantities are increasing, population increase is one of the reasons, but we also have more advanced wastewater treatment processes and advanced processes. Each additional process generates more sludge, and so that's another reason. And the cost is increasing, the treatment cost, but more importantly, it is the disposal cost. And in recent years, you probably heard about PFAS, for example, and I will get into that. But now the issue we have, again, is the very limited disposal options. Typically three alternatives: land application or beneficial use of sludge, maybe as a fertilizer on farmland, or it can be also in parks or other areas. Incineration, very important also for energy generation. And these are really perfect options for sludge management. Landfilling is not really desired. Landfills are expensive spaces, they are engineered spaces, and landfilling was really phased out. But now, unfortunately, what is happening, landfilling is coming back because of some of the new developments in the regulatory and policy landscape because of these persistent chemicals. And suddenly wastewater treatment plants or municipalities, they are running out of options. And so they kind of started landfilling again. And there are very interesting statistics on this. Like in the past year in US, sludge disposal costs more than doubled. And the main reason for that is the increased percentage of landfilling in final disposal of wastewater sludges. Okay, so I mean, sludge is not a waste. Okay, I'd like to say that there are lots of opportunities, particularly resource recovery. Nutrients are very important. Phosphorus is a very limited resource. There's lots of phosphorus in sludge. It can be recovered and reused. Energy is so very important, and there's lots of energy to recover from sludge. And then there's also, you know, organic matter, organic carbon, biomaterials, biopolymers, the list goes on. But there are also concerns. Persistent chemicals is one. Another recent concern, microplastics. It is growing, and this is also as important as persistent chemicals. Emerging pathogens is another one, antibiotic resistance, nanoparticles. So these are kind of the most recent ones, but the top two, I think, are the most current concerns that are receiving lots of attention. So these are the hot topics. And I do research in all of these areas. Okay, so something I'd like to share. I mean, when we talk about sludge management, it's very closely related to circular economy, but also climate change. Like carbon footprint of sludge treatment is important. And what I would like to remind is, you know, like for treating sludge, obviously we use chemicals, fuel, electricity. So there is greenhouse gas emissions, but there's also greenhouse gas offsets, particularly for beneficial use of sludge. So biogas generation is important, but also we can recover, reuse nutrients. Sequestration of photosynthetic carbon, land application is the only disposal option that can achieve this, and this is also very important. And also soil improvement. So there are definitely benefits to reusing sludge in different forms or capacities. Okay, so I would like to cover a number of emerging pathogens and pollutants. So I will be brief, but if you have questions at the end of the presentation, I'm very happy to get into more details. So in biosolids, there are, you know, there's a very wide range of pathogens, bacteria, viruses, protozoa. There are also new emerging pathogens, SARS-CoV-2 for COVID-19. And now, for example, I already started receiving questions about monkeypox. Okay, so that is very new. And what I would like to highlight here is we still use E. coli, for example, to assess the biosafety of treated wastewater sludge, indicator bacteria, E. coli, coliform, etc. And there are some limitations to that, as you would agree that E. coli may not be a good indicator bacteria or good indicator for viruses. But also there's another limitation there, that we use culture-based methods. What are culture-based methods? So for example, if you have a petri dish, you know, you count the number of coliform colonies. So there is a culture-based method, but they have limitations. I'll just give you an example from our research, and this is for disinfection of wastewater, but the concept is very similar. So cultured methods can only quantify bacteria that are doing very well. If they are stressed or injured a bit, you know, they may not be doing very well at the moment, but they quickly recover and then continue replicating. And so it doesn't mean that they're dead. And for example, like this is after chlorine disinfection, chlorine exposure after typical chlorine doses. So this is like what we measure with cultured methods, so counting colonies. And for example, after chlorine disinfection, we see a very big decrease. And then we are under the assumption that, okay, like we killed all of the bacteria there. But in reality, if you use more advanced methods, these are molecular methods, PMA, qPCR. And what that does is we can identify also the stressed and injured microorganisms that are still alive, but they may not be able to grow on a petri dish. And if we do that, what we find is, in fact, you know, majority of those bacteria have not died yet. They're still viable. It's just like they are a little bit stressed or injured, but they can recover. Okay. So another concern for us is the antibiotic resistance. So this is also getting a lot of attention. This is also from our research. Just one slide I would like to share. So this is E. coli, indigenous E. coli isolate. So these are E. coli that is present in wastewater. And just one random wastewater sample, we isolated 98 E. coli isolates, and we checked their antibiotic resistance. So we had 6 antibiotics, including carbapenem, which is like the last line of defense for infections, and 55 of them were not resistant to any of these antibiotics. But guess what? 45% of them, which is like a really significant percentage, were resistant to antibiotics. So more importantly, a small percentage, 2% of these isolates were resistant to all 6 antibiotics that we tested. However, in dealing with microorganisms, one of the advantages we have is we can change the temperature, the chemical dose, and we might still be able to deal with these issues within the current existing wastewater treatment or sludge treatment technologies. So one recent study, and I like the Swedish studies because they have these fields where they do controlled experiments since early 1980s. So it has been a very long time. And so what they've done is they went back to those fields and then they checked the impact of antibiotics and antibiotic resistant genes in these sludge applied farmlands. And what they found is that application of sewage sludge did not cause accumulation of antibiotics in soil, and also long-term sludge amendment did not cause enrichment of resistant genes in soil. So this is definitely good to know. And again, this is not a lab scale study. This is like field study, full scale, and they can go back to 30, 40 years. Okay. So emerging microorganisms, my research group also does research on monitoring COVID-19 in wastewater in Ontario. And we get lots of questions about SARS-CoV-2 in sludge. The good news here is that SARS-CoV-2 is an envelope virus, and compared to all other microorganisms, you know, fungi, E. coli, protozoa, etc., that we deal with in wastewater treatment, in sludge treatment, it is truly the easiest one to kill. And so that really is not a concern for wastewater discharges or biosolids land application. That in fact, research so far has shown that infectious virus SARS-CoV-2 has not been found in even raw wastewater, and the keyword here is infectious, and definitely not after sludge or biosolids treatment. However, this doesn't mean that we do not detect the genetic material. We can detect the genetic material, but the genetic material doesn't indicate that there is a live virus or infective virus in sludge. And current wastewater and sludge treatment processes are effective against SARS-CoV-2. So really, there's no concern for this. There might be other viruses that are of concern that can survive typical sludge treatment processes, but SARS-CoV-2 is not one of them. Okay, nanoparticles, I'll just show you one slide. And nanoparticles are now used in lots of commercial products, textiles, and they end up in wastewater. So nanoparticles, compared to some of the other pollutants, like they've already been studying them for at least 10 years. And there are lots of studies out there. One of the issues that always we have to look at is, you know, sometimes to be able to see an impact, studies use much higher doses of nanoparticles, which may not be environmentally realistic. But also another thing, and this is, I think this study is unique because instead of spiking pristine nanoparticles to treated sludge, in this study, we spiked nanoparticles before anaerobic digestion, for example, and then we also applied them on soils and then looked at the fate and impact, and we could see the impact of silver nanoparticles and copper nanoparticles. And that is expected. Why? Because silver nanoparticles, they're basically disinfectants. Obviously, you will see some impacts on microbial communities. However, the impacts were relatively short-lived, and then they gradually decreased over time. But it is also important to emphasize that there are differences in the toxicity of these nanoparticles. So this study was for silver and copper nanoparticles, and we observed that copper nanoparticles were more toxic than silver nanoparticles. And there are, of course, other nanoparticles that are out there that they may be more toxic. Okay, so one of the really hot topics right now, microplastic pollution. And we just completed an environment and climate change funded study on this. And in fact, we have a story on the Carlton website today. And these are my wonderful PhD students, Kelly and Nimita, who are working on this project. And we're working with companies developing methods and technologies to enumerate and identify microplastics. And this is a huge challenge because this is a new type of contaminant and they're very small, and there are really no standard methods to extract them from samples, to quantify them, to identify them. And especially for water samples also, there's a huge need to be able to quantify them accurately, and not only in the lab, but also hopefully in the field. And this is one of the areas that we are working on. So in terms of microplastics and biosolids, there's some really nice studies from Europe that have already shown this in 2020. This is by Corradini and the co-workers. And, they're like different types of microplastics. Microplastics, they come in all sizes, shapes, fibers, films, so that is very challenging. And one of the key things with microplastics is they do not necessarily decompose. They're in the environment for thousands of years. However, they break up into smaller and smaller particles. So with biosolids, in biosolids, like if you look at a biosolid sample under the microscope, you see lots of microplastics. So we know that the microplastic concentration in biosolids is high, but these researchers show that after repeated application of biosolids to agricultural farm in the field, they also observed a higher number of microplastics in the soil after each biosolids application. And these are the quantities that they measured in sludge. So is it a concern? It is a concern because now we know that application of biosolids increases the microplastic quantities. But because I work on this topic, I check other sources of microplastics to agricultural soils. And if you look at, for example, surface water runoff, and there's lots of microplastics, there's lots of plastic trash in the environment. There are several sources of microplastics that may end up in terrestrial lands or in agricultural lands. And so if you compare the quantities of microplastics that come from sludge, it is very, very small compared to all other sources that microplastics come from. Just to put in perspective, because I think that's also very important. Okay, so PFAS is the big one. And this is still a developing story. Not that PFAS is new. What are PFAS? So these are chemicals that are very, very resistant to biodegradation because they're made to be resistant to very high temperatures. And they're also called forever chemicals. And this is not a new chemical group. First of all, I'd like to say that they are in the environment. They've been released to the environment since 1960s, 70s. In 1980s, Europe already started phasing them out. Okay, so this is a hot topic now, but in fact, we already knew that these chemicals were not good for the environment or for public health. And there are lots of other chemicals, very similar chemicals that we haven't focused on yet that are similar to PFAS that can accumulate in the environment because they do not biodegrade, but they can also bioaccumulate, which is different. So that is a real public health concern, because they can bioaccumulate and they can be transferred in the food chain, etc. Okay, so in Canada, I mean, in general, in legislations, typically the new regulations, they start in Europe. You know, it takes maybe 5 years that they come to US, and then maybe shortly after US, we see the impacts in Canada. And US is now Environment, EPA, Environment Protection Agency, is getting ready to regulate PFAS, and they are considering to maybe identify them as hazardous material. And if that happens, there are lots of implications. So a quick comment here also, realize that PFAS isn't everything. I mean, now I'm going to talk about PFAS in sludge, but these are environmental pollutants, environmental contaminants. They're in air, water, soil, they are everywhere. They're not in only sludge. So it's very important to understand that sludge is not the only source or is the major source. There's lots of other sources. They are in the environment, and obviously they end up in wastewater and in sludge. But they're also in cosmetics, you know, in, you know, Teflon pans, cooking. I read a recent article on microwavable popcorn. I mean, those coatings also have high concentrations, so they are really everywhere, and there's lots of sources that people can be exposed to these chemicals. So this is also very recent, April 2020, up to 20 million acres of farmland in US tainted by PFAS. So now we are really starting to see the impact of this for land application of biosolids. Because PFAS is in sludge, since they do not biodegrade, and repeated applications of sewage sludge to farmlands end up increasing the concentrations of PFAS. And this is May 23rd, just from a few days ago. Now companies face billions in damages as PFAS lawsuits flood courts in the US. And in fact, I just saw an article yesterday. Now, wastewater treatment plants are worried because they wonder if they could be sued as well. And they want to be excluded. Obviously, the manufacturers of PFAS, like DuPont and other chemical companies, are responsible, not necessarily wastewater treatment plants, but this is still developing, and it will be very interesting to see how these new regulations will evolve and what will be the impact on all these lawsuits, but also on land application of sludge. So there are lots of municipalities now that are kind of scared, and they switch to landfilling. Is landfilling the best option? I mean, absolutely not. You know, like I can also argue, okay, like if we do not want to land apply sludge, I understand it, but like then what are we gonna do? You know, what is the option? Like there are also like incineration is a great option as well. I mean, with incineration, you can also recover phosphorus much better than any other wastewater or sludge treatment processes, but they're expensive. And for PFAS, there was also a ban against incineration of PFAS containing wastes. Okay, so you cannot do this, you cannot do that, but then like we have to find a solution. We have to find a way to manage sludge. And it's also important to see the big picture and assess the feasibility and really understand what is realistic and what is not realistic, what can be done and what cannot be done. Okay. So there's a very nice Canadian study from Dr. Parker's group and Shirley and Smith from Environment Canada, and they looked at the PFAS concentrations in biosolids, PFAS can also be generated during biosolids treatment because of the precursor. So you can start with a lower concentration of PFAS and end up with a higher concentration of PFAS at the end of treatment. But what they observed is there wasn't really much happening during aerobic or anaerobic digestion in terms of decomposition and pelletization and alkaline stabilization processes. They observed some increase, and the behavior also, varies from treatment plant to treatment plant depending on the treatment processes used and the chemicals used. And this is the work from one of my students, and he compared the suggested thresholds in Germany and in UK for PFAS, PFOS compounds. And he did a literature survey and then looked at the concentrations reported from these countries. And then basically the reality is, we are already exceeding these concentrations. It's not that, like the existing concentrations of PFAS are much lower than the, target concentrations, threshold concentrations. So they're already high enough. And so that is an issue. Okay. So I'll take maybe 5 more minutes to talk about the developments in other places. Especially Europe. I think Europe is important, but you realize Europe is also a mixed bag. There are developing countries, there are countries that are more agricultural, there are countries that employ full incineration for all their biosolids treatment. But pink here is incineration. Green is the agriculture or compost, but it's, like every country is different. And it's very important to understand this because this also applies to Canada. With a country that has the size of Canada, you need to be realistic, and our population density is very small as well. We're not like Europe. So there's only so much we can do. There's only so much we can invest in really expensive technologies because we simply do not have the population density unless it is, Toronto, Montreal, etc., like big metropolitan areas. It is not really possible to do everything at the highest level, the best way. It's just not realistic to expect that. Honestly, in Canada, we are still unable to provide safe drinking water to our rural communities, indigenous communities. So it is very important to be realistic. Now, Germany is now switching to incineration, and this is happening since 2018. Germany was using land application heavily, and they decided that they will switch to incineration. And it is difficult. Like, at the time, this came as a shock, and all my colleagues in Germany at treatment plants, they were saying, it's impossible. There's no way the country can make this change. But you know what? They did. So they have very aggressive requirements, such as reducing phosphorus content of sludge by 50%. So this really you cannot achieve with other methods other than incineration. You can recover phosphorus from ash very effectively, more than 80%, even 90%. But also incineration is not just the incineration of mixed waste. They are forcing mono incineration. So these are incineration units for wastewater treatment plants only. So it's not mixed waste, or it is not mixed with other, organic waste or solid waste, etc. And they've already done this. Now they have the networks. So, like bunch of treatment plants collect their sludge and send it to these central incineration facilities. But in a very short time, they've made this change. Sweden is interesting. Sweden traditionally is a very strong supporter of land application of biosolids, because if we think about circular economy, really it is the land application really that puts back this material in soil, reuses the nutrients, carbon, and they have several goals, but they're also doing this in a smart way. They focus on phasing out of non-biodegradable and bioaccumulative substances. And again, they've been running these like fields, controlled fields already for a long time, since 1981. And what they've shown is the crop yield is better with sludge treatment. The phosphorus content in soil is better with sludge treatment, and there isn't appreciable changes in heavy metals. And there's also lots of focus on energy generation. So this is from a treatment plant in Denmark, Copenhagen. And this is already their 2015 numbers. Their goal for 2025 was to be carbon neutral, 100%. But they operate their treatment plants at a level that they are energy generation facilities, and they sell energy and they make money out of this, out of wastewater treatment. And but how they operate is very different than how we run our wastewater treatment plants in North America. Okay, so my last slide. Okay, so what are we going to do? Okay, so we are in this situation. First of all, environmental pollution is everywhere. I mean, we talk about wastewater, we talk about sludge. Wastewater treatment plants are not responsible for this pollution. They're simply trying to clean up this pollution. Unfortunately, they come under pressure, but they're not the generators of this pollution. And source control is essential. This is what we learned from PFAS and also microplastics. Is it like microplastics are going to be there for thousands of years. Unless you control the source, there is no point in trying to deal with controlling or recovering or, you know, treating the waste once it is released into the environment and it is everywhere. So it is essential that some ban or phasing out of persistent chemicals needs to happen. And we need to be proactive versus reactive. Like for PFAS, we knew since 1980s, 90s that the chemical was nasty. It is only 2020 now that we are really like in this panicky mode, trying to take action. And it's important to understand that technology alone cannot be the solution. And I'm an engineer, I'm saying this. Yes, we can come up with really nice advanced technologies, but if source control is not done, there's really not much we can do at the wastewater treatment plant level, or it will be so expensive, it's just not going to be realistic or feasible. Resource recovery, very important, energy and nutrients, and circular economy should be kept in mind. We talk about climate change, you know, there are excellent uses for biosolids as well, also for land application. So incineration and land application should stay. They're equally important and hopefully will stay away from landfilling. As I see, that is probably the worst option for sludge management. Thank you.